Do I look very much like the same guy anymore? There's my mother and father, and my aunt and uncle, and there's me. And here's my younger brother, Gordon. And he was in the Army. So we had, my older brother was in the Marine Corps, and I was in the Navy, and my younger brother was in the Army. And my younger brother had a good friend named Ed Pello, and Ed Pello married Mary Lou Lutz Pello, who I grew up with. And Ed and Gordon left to go to Europe toward the end of the war, but it was in the Battle of the Bulge, and they got there for the last part of the Battle of the Bulge. But anyway, we took some pictures of them. There's Ed. There I am. There's my younger brother. Here's my couple of my guys on my boat crew. Here's our ship. Here was the commissioning ceremony. There are the boat davits. You can see how they're stacked up there, one on top of the other. There's a picture of me that was in the service. Oh, there's Captain Kassam and his bride. That's the one that I had to. There are two of the officers that are on our ship. There's Henry Hernsberger. He was the doctor that I lived with. There's my boat crew. These guys are all part of my crew. That's me back there. And they were in the LCVP, and you can see they're trending up quite a... There's 4 of the LCVPs chugging along.
And you piloted one of those.
Oh, yeah. Well, the coxswain piloted it.
You were
the officer didn't pilot it, officers. But this was my boat crew here.
So were you on the LCVPs when they did the landings?
I would have been, yes. Yeah, because it was a very elaborate system, because of course they had, I don't know, several dozen of the ships like mine, and all of them had 4 LCVPs. And so we just didn't all go ashore haphazardly. We all went ashore in formation and at the same time. And we would circle out away from, far enough offshore so that the artillery couldn't get us. We would circle until it was ready to go. And then there were people who were senior officers would decide when we were to make the run on the shore. And that would be after they had bombarded the shore thoroughly. And we were supposed to ashore. There weren't supposed to be anybody alive left, but sometimes...
That's the theory, anyway.
Yeah. This letter was written to me by Tom Buell, and I've got a couple of books from Tom Buell in there. He was a naval officer, and he checked on where the Beverly Reed was after the war. And it turned out that they scrapped it and sold the scrap to Japan.
They made razor blades with it.
Yeah.
What were you doing when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor?
I was at church, and the minister's name was Maurice Cours, C-O-U-E-R-S, Maurice Cours. And he was a real live minister. The Baptist Church had kind of lost a lot of its members, but he built the membership right back up. And he was really good with the young people, and it was called BYPU, Baptist Young People's Association, BYPU. And we were meeting Sunday night. That was when he heard on the radio that Pearl Harbor had been bombed. So I was at church. I was not in the service.
What did you do and your effects in World War II?
What did I do? Well, I started out after midshipman school and became an officer. I started out as boat officer in charge of those small boats. And then, after the war ended, I was still in the service. I was one of the last ones to get in, and so these guys had been in a lot longer than I had. We got out first, and I became the executive officer of this ship. I was only about 23 at that time, and the executive officer actually kind of runs the ship. The captain is the overall boss of the ship. And it was interesting. We were talking with your granddad about the police force. The same was true. That same idea was true on the ship. The captain was the head man on the ship. And if the captain, what he said, you had to do it. The executive officer was right under the captain, and he was the one to make sure that the ship was running properly. And so the executive officer was really the bad guy. He was the one that, if somebody needed a bawling out, he's the one that bawled them out. Or if they needed to go to captain's mast, that means almost like going on a trial, and the captain decides. But the captain would then usually let them off, and so he would be the good guy. So the executive officer was the bad guy, and the captain was the good guy. And that was true on most ships I was on. Both ships I was on, I should say. Does that make sense?
Did you agree with President D. Roosevelt?
Did I do what?
Did you agree with President Roosevelt to put Japanese Americans in concentration camps during the war?
Well, it turns out, of course, that was a terrible thing to do, because a lot of those people were good, loyal Americans, and yet they couldn't be sure, and it was a mass psychology that everybody was afraid. We'd see a ship offshore and we think it was a submarine, a German submarine, and everything that was going to happen we were afraid was going to be bad. And those people were a unified group of aliens, even though they were American citizens, a lot of them born here, and yet they were enough different from us, and we were fighting the Japanese. In fact, they weren't Japanese, they were yellow-bellied Japs. That was what we called them. You didn't like Japanese, because they bombed Pearl Harbor. And they did it without any warning, and they did it, they killed a lot of people. And so the idea that we were kind of making sure that these people didn't have an uncle in Japan who was telling them to do something bad here in the States because they were citizens here. I guess we just figured we had to play safe. We had to be sure that those people weren't going to be in our country and do something that would hurt our country during the war. So it turns out, of course, that everybody thinks it's terrible that we did that to the Japanese that were citizens, and yet we can understand how in the turmoil that was there, we were trying to protect ourselves.
Get everything finished, Landy? Oh, where's Landy?
They're still in there.
Oh, they're still in there.
How did the war change your life?
Well, I'm not sure if I would have been able to afford medical school if I hadn't been in the service. It taught me a lot about discipline. It taught me a lot about levels of power, because all the services have different levels of power, and the guy who's above you, you have to do what he tells you in general. And so you learn how to behave yourself, you learn what you can do and what you can't do, and I think discipline is one of the main things it teaches you.
Do you remember victory in Europe What do you remember about it?
About what?
About Victor in Europe.
Well, I remember when the Russians and the Americans met in Berlin, and that was right before Hitler had killed himself, and the people that took over when Hitler died declared that it was a complete victory. And I think that was one of the main things I remember was when the war ended in Europe, and everybody said, well, now we can end the war in Japan. And there was a general named Douglas MacArthur who was in charge of Japan, and he was the one that took the Japanese surrender on board the USS Missouri at the end of the war, of the whole end of the war. That was when Japan conceded defeat. You've given a lot of thought into these questions, haven't you? Yes, you have. After I got out of the service and went back to school, finished up at Dayton, and then went to Michigan, I was still in the Naval Reserve for another 13 years when they could have called me back had they needed me. But being in medical school was better than just being employed somewhere, because I was learning something that they could use, and the fact that they sent me to medical school meant that I might have to serve some time in the Navy as a doctor to make up for what they paid for while I was there. So I stayed in the Navy for another 13 years, and finally they figured that I wasn't much good to them anymore, and they gave me an honorable discharge.
Okay, I have a question. This is just saying that I interviewed you, and then I'll just be using the questions that I asked you for my paper at school. So I was wondering if you could sign this and then